The scream came first, high and animal, cutting through the smoke like a blade through silk. Private Daniel Hayes froze in the rubble-choked street, his rifle slipping against his sweat-slicked palms. Around him, Munich burned in shades of amber and ash, the April wind carrying the stench of cordite and charred wood. He should have kept walking. The war was days from over, and survival meant following orders, staying with your unit, not chasing ghosts into collapsing buildings. But the scream came again. It was a child. Daniel's boots crunched over shattered glass as he approached the 3-story residence, its facade peeling like sunburned skin. Flames licked from the upper windows, and the heat pressed against his face like an open hand. Inside, through the smoke, he heard coughing, small, desperate, fading. "Anyone see a kid?" he shouted to the 2 soldiers behind him. Corporal Miller didn't look up from the supply crate he was looting. "Let it burn, Hayes. We got orders to move out in 20. But Daniel was already crossing the threshold. The interior was a hell of blackened beams and collapsing plaster. He pulled his neckerchief over his mouth and climbed the staircase, testing each step before committing his weight. 2nd floor. The coughing grew louder. He kicked open a door and found her, a girl, maybe 5 years old, curled beneath a wooden table, her face streaked with soot and tears. Her blonde hair was singed at the edges. She wore a nightgown embroidered with small blue flowers, and pinned to her collar was a metal eagle, a Nazi party pin. Daniel's stomach turned. For a heartbeat, he stood paralyzed. The weight of every briefing, every propaganda poster, every fallen friend pressing down on him. This child was the enemy? Her father had probably worn the same insignia on a uniform, maybe even aimed a rifle at American boys. But she was also dying. He scooped her into his arms and ran. The staircase gave way behind him with a roar, and they tumbled out into the street just as the roof collapsed inward, sending a plume of embers spiraling into the twilight. Daniel lay gasping on the cobblestones, the girl limp against his chest. Her eyes fluttered open, pale blue, rimmed with red, and she whispered something in German he didn't understand. Miller appeared above them, his face twisted in disgust. "What the hell did you just do?" "Before we go any further, I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if you're here for stories that reveal the complicated, beautiful mess of being human, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't regret it." Daniel got to his feet, the girl still cradled in his arms. "She's just a kid, Miller. She's a Kraut kid." Miller spat into the rubble. "You see that pin? You know what that means?" "It means her parents made choices she didn't." But the damage was done. By the time they returned to the temporary encampment, a commandeered school building 2 blocks west, word had already spread. Private Hayes had saved a Nazi. The men stood in clusters, their faces hard, their voices low. Daniel felt their eyes on him as he carried the girl to the medic's tent, where a tired lieutenant named Bosworth took one look at the pin and shook his head. "You can't keep her here, Hayes. She doesn't have anyone else. That's not our problem." Daniel set the girl down on a cot. She hadn't spoken again, just stared at him with those 2 wide eyes, her small hand clutching the fabric of his sleeve. Bosworth sighed and gestured to a corner. "I'll patch her up, but come morning, she goes to a displaced persons camp. That's protocol." "Protocol," Daniel echoed bitterly. That night he sat beside her cot while she slept, her breathing shallow and ragged. He thought about his younger sister back in Ohio, Maggie, who'd been 6 when he shipped out, who'd cried into his uniform and made him promise to come home. This girl looked nothing like Maggie, but the way she'd gripped his sleeve, desperate and trusting, felt exactly the same. At 0400 hours, Daniel made his decision. He wrapped the girl in a wool blanket, tucked a canteen and 2 ration bars into his pack, and slipped out of the camp while the sentries changed shifts. The city was a labyrinth of rubble and shadows, and he moved through it like a ghost, the girl's weight light against his shoulder. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't stay. Behind him, Munich burned. Ahead, in the pre-dawn dark, the future waited, uncertain, dangerous, and entirely his own. But what Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the girl he'd saved wasn't just any child. She was the daughter of a man the Allies had been hunting for months, and by sunrise, his own unit would be hunting him too. The girl's name was Greta. Daniel learned this at dawn, crouched in the skeletal remains of a bombed-out bakery, watching her trace letters in the dust with one finger. Greta. She spoke no English, and his German consisted of maybe 20 words cobbled together from training manuals and shouted orders. But she pointed to herself when she finished writing, then looked at him expectantly. "Daniel," he said, tapping his chest. She repeated it, "Daniel." Her pronunciation soft and uncertain, and something in his chest cracked open. Outside, the city was waking. American jeeps rumbled past on patrol, their engines echoing off broken walls. Twice, Daniel pressed Greta flat against the floor, his hand gentle over her mouth, as soldiers passed close enough that he could hear their conversation. They weren't looking for him yet, but they would be soon. He needed papers, food, a plan that extended beyond the next hour. What he had instead was a 5-year-old who flinched at loud noises and hadn't eaten in God knew how long. The bakery's cellar was intact, a miracle of structural engineering or dumb luck. Daniel found 3 jars of preserves, a sack of stale flour, and a cache of civilian clothes that the previous occupants must have hidden before fleeing or dying. He dressed Greta in a wool dress 2 sizes too large, rolling up the sleeves and cinching the waist with twine. The Nazi pin went into his pocket, evidence or insurance. He wasn't sure which. "We need to move," he said, more to himself than to her. Greta tilted her head, not understanding the words but reading his tone. She took his hand without hesitation, and that simple trust made him want to weep. They moved through the city like refugees, which Daniel supposed was exactly what they were. Munich in April of 1945 was a graveyard dressed in spring sunshine. Rubble stretched for blocks, punctuated by buildings that refused to fall, their walls standing defiantly amid the destruction. Displaced persons shuffled past in ragged columns, their faces blank with exhaustion. No one looked twice at a man and a child, until they did. The checkpoint appeared at the intersection of Ludwigstrasse and Leopoldstrasse. 2 MPs flanking a wooden barricade, checking papers and asking questions. Daniel spotted them too late. Turning back would draw attention. Moving forward meant lying better than he'd ever lied in his life. "Stay close," he whispered to Greta, "and don't say anything." The older MP was Sergeant Hayes's age, maybe 30, with the dead-eyed look of someone who'd seen too much and felt too little. He held out his hand without speaking. Daniel reached for his military ID, then stopped. If they ran his name, if they checked with his unit. "Papers," the MP repeated, his voice flat. "Lost them in the fighting," Daniel said, forcing his accent toward the local dialect he'd heard in taverns before the push. House collapsed. Wife died. Just trying to get my daughter to her grandmother in pacing. The lie came easier than it should have. The MP's eyes flicked to Greta, who stood pressed against Daniel's leg, her face half hidden in his coat. For a terrible moment, Daniel thought she might speak, might reveal them both with a single German word that would shatter his story. Instead, she coughed, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of smoke inhalation and fever. She needs medicine, Daniel added quickly. Please, we've been walking for 2 days. The younger MP, barely 20, stepped forward. Sir, we should let them through. The older MP waved them on, already bored. Half the city's orphaned or widowed. One more doesn't matter. Daniel walked past the checkpoint without exhaling, Greta's hand hot and small in his. They'd made it 50 yards when he heard the shout. Hayes! Daniel Hayes! He turned. Corporal Miller stood at the checkpoint, his face red with exertion and rage, pointing directly at them. That's him! That's the son of a bitch who deserted! The world narrowed to a single choice: run or surrender. Daniel ran. He scooped Greta into his arms and bolted down an alley, his boots skidding on loose stone. Behind him, whistles shrieked and boots pounded concrete. The MPs were younger, faster, unburdened by a child. Daniel's lungs burned. His shoulders screamed. Greta buried her face in his neck, and he felt her tears, hot and frightened, against his skin. I've got you, he panted. I've got you. He ducked through a bombed-out tailor shop, vaulted a collapsed wall, and emerged into a courtyard choked with weeds and wreckage. A door stood ajar at the far end, blackness beyond it, promising nothing. Daniel plunged through. The darkness swallowed them whole. He heard the MPs enter the courtyard, heard Miller shouting orders, heard the systematic search beginning. Daniel backed deeper into the building, one hand on the wall, the other cradling Greta. His boot struck something soft, a body. He bit down on his tongue to keep from crying out. His eyes adjusted. Not one body. 7. Civilians by their clothes. Days dead, maybe weeks. The smell was indescribable. Greta whimpered, and Daniel pressed his hand over her mouth, hating himself. Outside, Miller's voice drifted closer. Check every room. He's got nowhere to go. Daniel's hand found a door handle, locked. He threw his shoulder against it once, twice, and on the third impact, the rotted wood gave way. They tumbled into a storage room, and Daniel pulled the door closed behind them, wedging a fallen beam against it. In the darkness, Greta began to cry, quiet, hiccuping sobs that broke something inside him. Shh, he whispered, rocking her. Shh, kleine Greta, du bist sicher. You're safe. The words came from nowhere, from some half-remembered phrasebook, and he had no idea if he'd said them right. But she quieted. They stayed there for 3 hours, Daniel's back against the door, Greta curled in his lap, both of them listening as Miller's search party moved through the building and eventually gave up. When silence finally returned, Daniel's legs had gone numb, and Greta had fallen asleep, her thumb in her mouth. He looked down at her soot-stained face and wondered what the hell he'd gotten them into. The answer came the next morning, whispered in the displaced persons camp where Daniel traded his watch for bread and information. Greta wasn't just any Nazi's daughter. She was the child of Oberst Friedrich Hartmann, a colonel implicated in the massacre of American POWs outside Malmedy. The Allies had been hunting him for months. He'd disappeared in March, and intelligence suggested he'd fled to Argentina. But he'd left his daughter behind, and now Daniel had made her his. The weight of that knowledge pressed down like concrete. If they caught him now, it wouldn't be desertion. It would be treason, aiding and abetting a war criminal's family, harboring the enemy. But when Greta woke and smiled at him, the first real smile he'd seen on her face, Daniel knew he'd already made his choice. They were going to disappear. and God help anyone who tried to stop them. The safest place to hide, Daniel learned, was among the broken. For 2 weeks, they moved through the displaced persons camps that dotted the Bavarian countryside like open wounds. Hundreds of thousands of people, former prisoners, refugees, orphans, the starving and stateless, all compressed into tent cities and requisitioned barracks, waiting for the war to officially end and someone to tell them where home was now. Daniel and Greta became ghosts in that vast machinery of human suffering. He kept his head down, his story simple. A widowed German mechanic named Klaus Zimmermann, traveling with his daughter toward family in Switzerland. His German improved through necessity. Each conversation, a tightrope walk over exposure. Greta, for her part, seemed to understand the game they were playing. She rarely spoke in public, clinging to Daniel's hand, her pale eyes watching everything. At night, huddled together under a donated blanket in whatever corner they'd claimed, Daniel would tell her stories in broken German. Stories about Ohio, about his sister Maggie and her obsession with collecting smooth river stones, about his mother's apple pie and autumn leaves and snow that fell soft as whispers. Greta would listen, her small fingers playing with the buttons on his shirt, and sometimes she'd whisper back, fragments of her own life before the fire. Her mother's lullabies, her father's tall boots, a dog named Wolf who'd slept at the foot of her bed. She never asked where her parents were. Some part of her already knew. By mid-May, they'd reached a camp outside Landsberg, a sprawling complex that housed over 7,000 displaced persons. Daniel found work in the camp's makeshift kitchens, peeling potatoes and hauling water in exchange for extra rations. Greta stayed close, helping where she could, her presence gradually accepted by the other children who ran wild through the camp's muddy lanes. It was there, on a Tuesday morning, that everything changed. Daniel was carrying 2 buckets of water from the pump when he heard the voice, American, authoritative, asking questions at the camp's main gate. He set down the buckets slowly, ice crystallizing in his veins. "We're looking for a deserter. Private Daniel Hayes, last seen in Munich on April 21st, traveling with a German child, approximately 5 years old." The camp administrator, a French priest named Father Dubois, responded in careful English. "Many men and children pass through here. Do you have a photograph?" Daniel didn't wait to hear more. He moved quickly but not frantically, crossing toward the women's barracks where Greta was supposed to be playing with the other children. His mind raced through calculations. Could they slip out the south fence? Were there soldiers covering the perimeter? How much time did they have? He found Greta sitting on a wooden crate, braiding wildflowers into a crown with a girl her age. But standing beside them, watching with an expression Daniel couldn't read, was a woman he'd seen around the camp, mid-30s, dark hair, a distinctive scar running from her temple to her jaw. She looked at Daniel, then at Greta, then back at Daniel. "You should go," she said quietly in German. "Now. The Americans are at the gate." Daniel's hand found Greta's. "Why are you helping us?" The woman's smile was bitter. "Because I know what it means to protect a child everyone else wants dead." She pressed something into his palm, a folded paper. "There's a farmhouse, 15 kilometers north. Family named Kohler. Tell them Elsa Braun sent you." She paused, her eyes meeting his with fierce intensity. "But you should know something about the girl you're protecting." Daniel's throat tightened. "I know who her father was." "No." Elsa shook her head. "You don't." She knelt before Greta, studying her face with an expression that was almost tender. "Your mother," she said in German. "Anna Hartmann. What was her maiden name?" Greta's voice was barely a whisper. "Rosenbaum." The word hung in the air like a grenade. Elsa looked up at Daniel. "Rosenbaum is a Jewish name. Anna Hartmann was born Anna Rosenbaum in Berlin, 1915. She hid her heritage to survive, married a Nazi officer for protection. It worked, until it didn't. Her voice hardened. Friedrich Hartmann discovered the truth 3 months ago. That's why their house was accidentally targeted by Allied bombing. That's why Anna Hartmann died in that fire. The world tilted. Daniel stared at Greta, this child he'd saved, this enemy he'd protected, and saw her with new eyes. She wasn't the daughter of a war criminal. She was his victim. The Nazis killed her mother, Elsa continued, standing. And Friedrich Hartmann let them do it. He's the one who reported Anna to the Gestapo, who arranged for their house to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Greta wasn't supposed to survive. Daniel's voice came out raw. How do you know this? Because I worked in the office that processed the denunciation. Elsa's scar seemed to pulse in the morning light. I was the secretary who typed up the order. I tried to warn Anna, but her voice broke. I was too late. Greta stood perfectly still, her flower crown forgotten, and Daniel realized she'd understood every word. The pieces of her young life were clicking together in real time, forming a picture no child should have to see. Your father wanted you dead, Elsa said gently, kneeling again. But this man, this American soldier who doesn't even speak your language, he ran into fire to save you. Do you understand? Greta nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. Then she turned to Daniel and said, in careful, heavily accented English, You are my papa. Now? The question shattered him. Daniel dropped to his knees, pulling her into his arms, and for the first time since the war began, he let himself cry. Yes, he whispered into her hair. Yes, Kleine, Greta, I'm your papa now. Behind them, voices shouted in English. The search was intensifying. Elsa pressed the paper into Daniel's hand again. The Kohlers will hide you. They owe me a debt. But you need to leave right now before… Elsa Braun? They all turned. An American captain stood 10 yards away, flanked by 2 MPs. His eyes moved from Elsa to Daniel to Greta, and recognition bloomed across his face like blood in water. Private Daniel Hayes, you're under arrest for desertion and aiding the enemy. Daniel stood, positioning himself between the soldiers and Greta. His voice was steady. She's not the enemy. She never was. That's not for you to decide. Then who decides? Daniel's anger ignited. You? Command? The same people who told us to burn cities and call it liberation. He felt Greta's hand slip into his. Her mother was Jewish. Her father tried to have her killed. I'm the only family she has left. The captain's expression flickered. Doubt, maybe, or exhaustion. Hayes, you deserted your unit. You violated direct orders. Whether the child is innocent or not, she is innocent. You still broke the law. For a long moment, no one moved. The camp fell silent. Hundreds of displaced persons watching this confrontation play out. This small rebellion against the machinery of military justice. Then Elsa Braun stepped forward. Captain, she said in perfect English. Before you arrest this man, you should know that I have documented evidence of 17 American officers who accepted bribes from Nazi officials in exchange for safe passage to South America, including the names of 3 officers currently stationed in Munich. Her smile was sharp as broken glass. I'm willing to trade that information for Private Hayes's freedom. The captain's face went white. You're bluffing. Try me. The standoff lasted 30 seconds. 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Then the captain exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. We never found him, he said quietly to the MPs. The lead was bad. Let's move out. They turned and walked away. Daniel stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Elsa touched his shoulder gently. Go to the Kohlers. Stay there until the war is officially over. After that, she shrugged. After that, you'll figure it out. Why? Daniel asked. Why risk yourself for us? Elsa looked at Greta, her scarred face softening. Because every child we save is an act of defiance. Every life we protect is proof that they didn't win. She kissed Greta's forehead. Be brave, little one, and remember your mother. That afternoon, Daniel and Greta walked north toward the Kohler farm, leaving the camp behind. Greta's hand was warm in his, and occasionally she'd look up at him and smile. Not the frightened smile of a victim, but something newer, more fragile. The smile of a daughter who'd found her father. But in Munich, Corporal Miller was making a report. And in a farmhouse outside Nuremberg, Friedrich Hartmann was learning that his daughter had survived. The chase was far from over. The Kohler farm emerged from the Bavarian hills like something from a storybook. Timber-framed walls the color of honey, a slate roof patched with moss, and fields that rolled away in waves of early wheat and wildflowers. Chickens scattered as Daniel and Greta approached, and somewhere behind the barn, a cow lowed mournfully. But it was the smell that struck Daniel first. Bread baking, earth turning, life continuing despite everything. Normal. The door opened before he could knock. The woman standing there was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair braided around her head and hands that spoke of decades of labor. She looked at Daniel, then at Greta, then at the paper he held out. Elsa sent you, she said in German. Not a question. Yes. The American and the Jewish child. Again, not a question. Daniel's hand tightened protectively on Greta's shoulder. We can leave if... Nonsense. The woman, Frau Kohler, stepped aside. Come in. Both of you. You look half dead. The farmhouse interior was dim and cool, cluttered with the accumulation of generations. Photographs lined the mantel above a stone fireplace. Young men in various uniforms spanning decades, some in the Kaiser's army, some in Wehrmacht gray. Daniel counted 3 frames draped in black cloth. My sons, Frau Kohler said, following his gaze. 2 died in Russia, 1 at Normandy. She moved to the stove where a pot of soup simmered. So when Elsa asks me to hide an American deserter who saved a Jewish child, I say yes. Because maybe somewhere, someone showed my boys kindness too. Her husband appeared in the doorway, gaunt and weathered, missing his left arm below the elbow. He studied Daniel with eyes that had seen too much, then nodded once, and disappeared back outside. Herr Kohler doesn't speak anymore, Frau Kohler explained, ladling soup into wooden bowls. Not since he came back from Stalingrad, but he understands everything. She set the bowls on the table. Sit, eat. Then we'll talk about how long you're staying. That night, Daniel and Greta slept in a loft above the barn, nested in clean hay with wool blankets that smelled of lavender. Greta fell asleep almost immediately, her thumb in her mouth, one hand clutching Daniel's shirt. He lay awake watching moonlight filter through the slats, listening to the sounds of the farm settling around them. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to imagine a future. Maybe they could stay here, help with the harvest. Daniel could work the fields, learn farming, build a life that had nothing to do with uniforms or orders or death. Maybe Greta could grow up knowing safety, could learn to laugh without flinching at loud noises, could become whoever she was meant to be before the world tried to kill her. Maybe. The days fell into rhythm. Daniel worked alongside Herr Kohler, communicating through gesture and shared labor. The old man taught him to milk the cow, to repair fences, to read the sky for coming rain. Greta followed Frau Kohler through the house, learning to knead bread and gather eggs and tend the kitchen garden. Her German grew confident, and slowly, so slowly Daniel almost missed it, she began teaching him words in return. Schmetterling, she'd say, pointing to a butterfly. Butterfly. Butterfly, he'd repeat, mangling the pronunciation, and she'd giggle. The sound of her laughter was medicine, but peace, Daniel learned, was always temporary. On the third week of June, a truck rumbled up the farm road. American military police. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He was in the barn, pitchfork in hand, Greta playing in the hayloft above. Through the open door, he watched Frau Kohler emerge from the house, wiping her hands on her apron, her face serene. The MPs climbed out, 3 of them, led by a lieutenant Daniel didn't recognize. They spoke in English, and though Daniel couldn't hear the words, he understood the tone. Official, demanding, suspicious. Frau Kohler shook her head, spreading her hands in a gesture of incomprehension. She called toward the barn in German. Klaus, come here. Klaus, his cover name. Daniel set down the pitchfork and walked out into the sunlight, his heart hammering. He kept his gait steady, his expression mild, just a simple farmer responding to his employer. This is Klaus Zimmermann, Frau Kohler said in German. A refugee from Munich. He works for his room and board. The lieutenant studied Daniel with narrow eyes. Ask him if he's seen any American deserters in the area, Frau Kohler translated. Daniel shook his head, offering a response in carefully broken German about how few people traveled these roads. He says no one comes here except merchants and farmers, Frau Kohler reported. The lieutenant wasn't satisfied. He gestured to one of the MPs, who produced a photograph, Daniel's military ID picture. Show him this. Daniel looked at his own face staring back at him from the photo. His appearance had changed in 7 weeks, beard grown out, hair longer, skin browned by sun and labor. But the eyes were the same. He frowned at the photo, tilted his head as if trying to place the face, then shrugged and said in German, "Never seen him." Frau Kohler translated. The lieutenant held the photo closer. "You're sure? Look carefully." This time, Herr Kohler appeared from behind the barn, his presence sudden and solid. He positioned himself beside Daniel, his one good arm hanging loose at his side, his expression carved from stone. The message was clear. You're threatening my worker. The standoff lasted 10 seconds. Then a voice called from the hayloft, "Papa!" Everyone looked up. Greta stood in the loft opening, hay in her hair, holding a barn cat. She'd spoken in German, Papa, addressing Daniel without thinking. The lieutenant's eyes sharpened. "That's a child." "My daughter," Daniel said in German, heart racing. "Is there a problem?" But one of the MPs, younger, less weathered, was staring at Greta with dawning recognition. He pulled out a second photograph, this one creased and worn. Daniel caught a glimpse. A family portrait. Friedrich Hartmann in his colonel's uniform, a woman with dark hair, and between them, a little blonde girl with pale blue eyes. "Sir," the MP said slowly, "that's Greta Hartmann." The world stopped. The lieutenant grabbed the photo, looked at it, looked at Greta. "Get the girl! Arrest the man!" Daniel didn't think. He whistled, sharp and urgent, and Herr Kohler moved with the speed of old combat instinct. His hand swept up a shovel leaning against the barn wall, and he swung it at the nearest MP's knees. The man went down hard. "Run!" Frau Kohler screamed in English. Daniel vaulted into the barn, caught Greta as she scrambled down the ladder, and bolted for the back door. Behind him, shouting erupted. A gunshot cracked the air, splintering wood above his head. They burst out into the wheat field, Daniel's legs pumping, Greta bouncing in his arms. The wheat was chest high, golden and concealing. They dove into it, flattening themselves against the earth as boots pounded past, as voices called orders, as the search fanned out in the wrong direction. Daniel pressed his lips to Greta's ear. "Don't move, don't breathe." They lay there for an hour. 2. The sun blazed overhead, and insects crawled over their skin, but neither moved. Daniel could feel Greta's heart hammering against his chest, could hear her trying to control her breathing, could sense her terror. Finally, when the voices had moved far enough away, they crawled deeper into the wheat, moving low and slow toward the tree line half a kilometer distant. They'd almost made it when Daniel heard the distinctive click of a hammer being cocked. "Stand up, Hayes." Daniel rose slowly. Greta clutched against him. Corporal Miller stood 3 feet away, his service pistol aimed at Daniel's chest. His uniform was dirty, his face haggard, but his eyes burned with righteous fury. "It's over," Miller said. "Put the girl down." "No. I will shoot you." "Then shoot me." Daniel's voice was steady. "But you'll have to kill me to take her." Miller's hand trembled. "Do you have any idea what you've done? She's the daughter of a war criminal. Her father massacred American POWs. Her father tried to have her killed. Her mother was Jewish. Greta's a victim, Miller. Just like all those POWs. That doesn't change." "What? The law?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "The same law that let her father walk free while her mother burned? The same law that would throw this child into some displaced person's limbo to die of disease or starvation?" He took a step forward, and Miller's gun tracked him. "If that's the law, then I'm proud to break it." Miller's face contorted with conflict, duty warring against doubt. "They'll court-martial you. Firing squad for treason." "I know." "Then why?" "Because she's 5 years old, and someone has to choose her." Silence filled the wheat field. A lark sang somewhere overhead. The wind carried the smell of summer. Miller lowered his gun. "I didn't see you," he said quietly. "I lost you in the wheat. By the time I realized my mistake, you were gone." He met Daniel's eyes. "But Hayes, I mean this. I won't lie for you again. If they ask, I'll tell the truth." "I understand." Miller turned and walked back toward the farm. Daniel stood frozen, unable to believe they were still alive. Greta tugged his sleeve. "Papa, we go now?" "Yes, Kleine Greta." Daniel kissed her forehead. "We go now." They disappeared into the forest. But in Munich, Friedrich Hartmann had just received word that his daughter was alive, and he was coming to reclaim what he believed was his. The monastery sat like a fortress on the edge of the Bavarian Alps, its limestone walls rising from the mountainside as if carved from the rock itself. Brother Augustine answered Daniel's knock with the wary expression of a man who'd sheltered too many desperate souls during wartime. "Sanctuary," Daniel said in halting German. "Please, for my daughter." The monk's eyes moved from Daniel's haunted face to Greta's, then to the bruise blooming purple on Daniel's jaw, where he'd fallen running through the forest. Without a word, Brother Augustine stepped aside. The monastery had been a refuge for centuries, from plague, from wars, from the countless small cruelties of history. Its stones remembered the 30 Years' War, Napoleon's March, the Great War. Now it sheltered 15 monks, 3 war widows, and a revolving door of refugees who asked no questions and expected none asked in return. Daniel and Greta were given a cell in the guest wing, 10 feet by 8, containing a narrow bed, a wooden crucifix, and a window that looked out over valleys that seemed to stretch into eternity. That first night, as monastery bells rang vespers, Daniel stood at that window and allowed himself to believe they'd found something approaching safety. He was wrong. The warning came 3 days later, delivered by a widow named Gertrude, who'd arrived at the monastery with her 2 sons. She'd been traveling from Munich and brought news that made Daniel's blood run cold. "There's a man offering money," she said quietly, pulling Daniel aside in the monastery's herb garden while Greta helped Brother Augustine feed the chickens. "A lot of money. 5,000 Reichsmarks for information about an American soldier traveling with a blonde girl." Daniel's throat tightened. "Did you see this man?" "No, but my cousin did. Tall, expensive suit. He had a photograph of the girl." Gertrude's voice dropped to a whisper. "They say he's the child's father." The world tilted. Daniel had known intellectually that Friedrich Hartmann was alive, that he'd fled to South America or Switzerland or wherever rats like him scurried when the lights came on. But knowing and confronting were different animals. "Did your cousin tell him anything?" Gertrude shook her head. "She has no love for men who profit from war, but others will talk. 5,000 Reichsmarks is a fortune now." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay beside Greta, listening to her breathe, watching moonlight paint silver squares on the stone floor. In the morning, he would have to make a choice. Run again, deeper into the mountains, living like hunted animals until they died or were caught, or stand and face the man who'd tried to murder his own daughter. The decision was made for him at dawn. Daniel woke to voices in the courtyard, German, authoritative, wrong. He moved to the window and looked down. 3 men stood arguing with Brother Augustine. 2 wore suits that looked out of place in the mountain monastery. The third wore a long coat despite the summer heat, his back to Daniel, but something in his posture radiated controlled violence. "We know the American is here," one of the suited men said. "Give him up, and we'll leave peacefully." "There are many guests here," Brother Augustine replied calmly. "Men seeking God after war." "I'm not looking for God." The man in the coat turned, and Daniel saw his face for the first time. Friedrich Hartmann looked like his photographs. Sharp features, graying hair, eyes like chips of ice. But the photographs hadn't captured the aura of barely leashed fury that surrounded him, the sense that violence was his native language. "I'm looking for my daughter." Brother Augustine's expression didn't change. "There are no children here, only the widow Gertrude's sons." "Liar." Hartmann's voice was soft, which somehow made it more terrifying. "I have witnesses who saw an American and a girl matching my daughter's description enter this monastery 4 days ago. Bring them to me, or I'll search every room myself." Daniel felt Greta stir beside him. She sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and looked at him with a question in her expression. He pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed to the small wardrobe in the corner, their emergency hiding place, laughably inadequate now. But before he could move her, Greta walked to the window. She looked down into the courtyard, and Friedrich Hartmann looked up. Recognition flashed across his face, surprise, then calculation, then something that might have been relief or possession. "Greta," he called in German. "Mein kleines Mädchen, come down, Papa is here." Greta's hand found Daniel's. She didn't call out, didn't move toward the door. She just stood there, a 5-year-old girl looking at the man who'd killed her mother, and Daniel saw her make the same choice he'd made weeks ago in that burning building. She turned away from the window. "He's not my papa," she said quietly in English. "You are." Daniel heard boots on the stairs. He grabbed the only weapon available, the wooden crucifix from the wall, heavy and solid, and positioned himself in front of the door. His heart hammered. His hands sweated. He was a farmer's son from Ohio who'd never wanted to be a soldier, never wanted to kill, never wanted anything except to come home. But for this child, he would burn the world. The door exploded inward. Hartmann's men came first, the 2 in suits, trained fighters by the way they moved. Daniel swung the crucifix at the first one's head, connected with a sickening crack. The man went down. The second lunged, caught Daniel around the waist, and they crashed into the narrow bed. Greta screamed. Daniel fought like an animal, biting, clawing, using every dirty trick he'd learned in basic training. He got his thumb in the man's eye, felt wetness and heard howling, then drove his knee up and connected with something soft. The man rolled away, gasping. Daniel scrambled to his feet, blood pouring from his nose, and found himself facing Friedrich Hartmann. The former colonel held a pistol with the casual ease of someone who'd used one many times. "Enough," he said in perfect English. "Step away from my daughter. She's not your daughter anymore. She's my blood. You killed her mother." Hartmann's expression flickered, anger, maybe guilt, quickly suppressed. "Anna made choices that endangered us all. She lied about her heritage, contaminated our family line. She was your wife. She was Jewish filth who tricked me into marriage." Hartmann's voice was ice. "And Greta is the product of that contamination. But she's still a Hartmann, still mine to do with as I please." Daniel felt Greta pressed against his back, trembling. "You're not taking her." "I'm not asking permission, American." Hartmann raised the pistol, aiming at Daniel's chest. "Move aside or I'll kill you and take her anyway." The gun's barrel looked enormous. Daniel calculated angles, distances, the time it would take to cross the space between them versus the time it took to pull a trigger. The math didn't work in his favor. "No," Daniel said. Hartmann's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot, when it came, was deafening in the stone cell. But Daniel was still standing. Hartmann looked down at his chest, where a red flower was blooming across his white shirt. His expression was almost comical. Surprise, confusion, indignation that the universe had betrayed him. He fell. Behind him, Brother Augustine stood in the doorway, holding an ancient hunting rifle with shaking hands. The monk's face was gray. "Forgive me, Lord," he whispered, "but not all who take refuge here deserve sanctuary." The monastery erupted in chaos. Monks ran toward the sound of gunfire. The two injured men staggered to their feet and fled. Daniel dropped to his knees, pulling Greta into his arms, checking her for injuries he knew weren't there, but had to confirm anyway. "Is he gone?" Greta asked in a small voice. Daniel looked at Friedrich Hartmann's body, at the blood pooling beneath him, at the man who'd tried to kill his own daughter twice and nearly succeeded both times. He thought about justice, about karma, about the ways the universe sometimes corrected its own mistakes. "Yes," he said, "he's gone." Brother Augustine laid the rifle down with trembling hands. "You must leave, now. When authorities come, I'll say bandits attacked, that I acted in self-defense. But you," his voice broke, "I've killed a man. I've damned myself. Don't let it be for nothing." Daniel stood lifting Greta in his arms. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just save her. Make her life mean something." They left the monastery as dawn broke, descending the mountain path while behind them, bells tolled not for prayer, but for death. Greta buried her face in Daniel's neck, and he felt her tears hot against his skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry you had to see that." "Don't be sorry, Papa." Her voice was muffled but clear. "You chose me. Again." The words broke something in him, or maybe healed something. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. As they reached the valley floor, Daniel looked back once. The monastery sat serenely in the morning light, keeping its secrets like it had for centuries. Friedrich Hartmann's body would be buried in an unmarked grave. His death would go unrecorded. History would forget him. But Greta would live. And that, Daniel thought, was the only justice that mattered. The network had no name, no headquarters, no official existence. It was a web of debts and favors spanning from Munich to Marseille, built by people who'd learned that survival sometimes meant breaking every rule. Elsa Braun was its architect. She found Daniel and Greta 3 days after the monastery, intercepting them at a crossroads outside Rosenheim. Daniel nearly ran when her car appeared, a battered Mercedes with French plates, until she stepped out with her hands raised. "It's me. You're safe." "How did you—" "I know everything." Elsa's scarred face was grim. "Including what happened at the monastery. Brother Augustine sent word through channels." She looked at Greta, who stood pressed against Daniel's leg. "Friedrich Hartmann is dead, but his associates aren't, and they want the girl." Daniel's hand found Greta's shoulder protectively. "Why? He's gone. What does it matter now?" "Money." Elsa's voice was bitter. "Hartmann had accounts, property, assets hidden across Europe. Greta is his only heir. Whoever controls her controls millions." The words hung in the summer air like a curse. Daniel had been so focused on protecting Greta from her father that he hadn't considered the vultures who'd circle once Hartmann fell. "We need new papers," Elsa continued, already moving toward the car. "New identities, and we need to get you out of Germany entirely." "Where?" "America." Daniel stared at her. "I'm a deserter. They'll arrest me the moment I step on a transport ship." "Not if you're already dead." Elsa pulled an envelope from her coat. "Private Daniel Hayes died 2 weeks ago, in a field hospital outside Nuremberg. Complications from a wound sustained in combat. There's a death certificate, a burial record, even a letter to his family expressing condolences." Daniel's hands shook as he opened the envelope. The paperwork looked official, complete with stamps and signatures. "How?" "I told you. I have evidence against officers who need it to disappear. They were very cooperative." Elsa produced a second set of papers. "These are yours now. James Miller, Canadian national, civilian contractor with the Allied Occupation Forces, returning home with his adopted daughter Mary." "Miller?" Daniel's voice was hollow. "You used—" "Corporal Miller agreed to loan his name. He said he owed you one." Elsa's expression softened. "He also said to tell you that sometimes the right choice is the one that breaks you, but you do it anyway." Greta tugged Daniel's sleeve. "Papa, we go to America?" The question held such hope that Daniel wanted to weep. America, home, safety, everything he'd been fighting toward without daring to believe it was possible. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "We're going home." The journey took 6 weeks. Elsa's network passed them from hand to hand like a piece of precious cargo. A forger in Stuttgart who created flawless identification papers. A French resistance fighter who smuggled them across the border hidden in a hay wagon. A dock worker in Marseille who secured passage on a freighter bound for New York. No questions asked. At each stop, Daniel memorized their new story. James Miller, born in Toronto, 1910. Worked construction before the war, contracted by the Army Corps of Engineers for reconstruction projects. Adopted Mary after her parents, distant cousins, died in the bombing of Hamburg. Returning to rebuild their lives in Canada, Greta learned to answer to Mary. She practiced her English with Daniel during the long hours in safe houses and cramped train compartments, her accent fading, her vocabulary growing. She was bright, adaptive, learning to perform the role of James Miller's daughter with the same instinct for survival that had kept her alive this long. But sometimes, late at night, she'd wake screaming. Daniel would hold her, rocking gently, whispering reassurances in the darkness. "You're safe. I've got you. Nobody's going to hurt you." "Promise?" she'd whisper. "I promise." In Marseille, waiting for their ship to depart, they stayed in a boarding house run by a woman named Simone, who asked no questions and charged reasonable rates. The city was chaos. Refugees, soldiers, black market traders, people trying to cobble together new lives from the rubble of old ones. Daniel found work on the docks for 3 weeks, loading cargo to pay for food and lodging. Greta stayed with Simone, learning to speak French alongside her German and English, adding another layer to her collection of survival skills. On their last night in France, Simone made dinner. Bouillabaisse that tasted like the sea and home, and hope all mixed together. She and Daniel sat on the balcony while Greta slept inside, watching the Mediterranean reflect moonlight in shattered silver. "You love her," Simone said, not a question. "More than I knew was possible. She's not your blood. She's my daughter." Daniel's voice was firm. "Blood doesn't make family. Choice does." Simone smiled, the expression sad and knowing. "My daughter was killed in the war, murdered by collaborators for hiding Jewish children." She looked at Greta, sleeping peacefully inside. "Every child we save, every act of defiance against those who would destroy innocence, it's how we honor the ones we couldn't save." Daniel thought about Sarah back in Ohio, about the sister he hadn't seen in 3 years. Would she recognize him now? Would his mother forgive him for deserting, for choosing this path? Would they accept Greta, or would they see only the enemy's daughter? "What if they don't understand?" he asked quietly. "Then you make them understand." Simone's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "And if they can't, you build a new family from people who see what you see. That love is the only thing that matters in the end." The freighter SS Providence departed Marseille on August 3, 1945. Daniel and Greta stood at the rail watching Europe recede, the continent that had tried to kill them both shrinking into the distance. "Will I like America?" Greta asked in English, her small hand in his. "I think America will like you," Daniel replied. The crossing took 14 days. They shared a cramped cabin with 2 other families, all refugees fleeing different versions of the same nightmare. Daniel worked in the engine room to pay for their passage, returning each night covered in grease and exhaustion to find Greta waiting with a smile that made every sacrifice worthwhile. She was learning to be a child again, learning that the world could be safe, that adults could be trusted, that tomorrow might actually come. On the 13th day, Greta came to him with a question that had clearly been building. "Papa, when we get to America, will I have to forget? Forget Mama, forget Germany, forget everything?" Daniel knelt to her level, taking her hands in his. "No, Kleine Greta, never forget. Your mother loved you. She died protecting you. That's part of who you are." He touched her heart gently. "But you get to choose who you become. Mary Miller, American girl. Greta Hartman, survivor. Both. Neither. Whatever you need to be." "Can I be both?" "You can be anything you want." On August 17, 1945, the Statue of Liberty appeared through morning fog like a promise made solid. Daniel lifted Greta onto his shoulders so she could see, and together they watched America emerge from the mist. "Home," Greta whispered. "Home," Daniel agreed. But as the ship approached Ellis Island, Daniel saw the inspection stations, the officials checking papers, the machinery of immigration processing. His forged documents were perfect. Elsa had guaranteed it. But perfection was never perfect enough. What if someone recognized him? What if there was a list of deserters being circulated? What if after everything, after the fire and the flight and the father and the journey, they were separated at the very threshold of freedom? Daniel held Greta tighter and stepped into the inspection line, and prayed that choice in the end would be enough. The inspection hall at Ellis Island smelled of disinfectant, unwashed bodies, and desperation. Hundreds of refugees shuffled through lines that snaked between wooden barriers, each person clutching papers that represented either salvation or damnation, depending on which official's desk they reached. Daniel held Greta's hand as they moved forward, one slow step at a time. "Remember," he whispered in English, "your name is Mary Miller. We lived in Hamburg before the bombing. Your favorite color is yellow, and you want to be a teacher when you grow up." Greta nodded. her face serious beyond her years. She'd learned this performance in the 6 weeks since leaving Germany, practiced it in safe houses and train compartments until the lies became a second skin. But Daniel could feel her trembling. "It's going to be okay," he said, squeezing her hand. He wished he believed it. 3 stations ahead, an immigration officer was turning away a Polish family, citing irregularities in their documentation. The mother collapsed, sobbing, while her children clung to her skirts. Guards moved in to escort them toward the detention area, that bureaucratic purgatory where refugees waited weeks or months for appeals that rarely came. Daniel's throat tightened. Their papers were flawless. But flawless didn't matter if someone looked too closely, asked the wrong questions, decided on instinct that something didn't add up. Next, they stepped forward. The immigration officer was younger than Daniel expected, maybe 25, with the carefully neutral expression of someone trained not to see the humanity in front of him. His nameplate read, Officer T. Walsh. Papers. Daniel handed over the documents. Walsh studied them with methodical efficiency, comparing photographs to faces, checking stamps and signatures. His pen tapped against the desk in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. James Miller, Canadian national, civilian contractor. Walsh looked up. "Why didn't you return to Canada? Why route through American immigration?" Daniel's heart hammered, but his voice stayed steady. "My wife's family is in Ohio. Thought we'd settle there, start fresh. The contractor office said routing through New York would be faster for the adoption paperwork." "Wife's family?" Walsh flipped through the papers again. "I don't see a marriage certificate here." "My wife died," Daniel said quietly, the lie tasting like ash. 2 years ago. Cancer. Walsh's expression didn't change. He turned to Greta. "And this is your daughter?" "Adopted daughter. Mary." "Mary, do you speak English?" Greta nodded. "Yes, sir." "Where were you born?" "Hamburg, Germany." Her accent was good, still present but believable for a child who'd spent her early years overseas. "My parents died in the bombing. Mr. Miller was friends with my papa. He found me in a children's home and adopted me." The story was simple, practiced, impossible to disprove without extensive investigation. Walsh studied Greta's face, and Daniel saw the moment of calculation. Was it worth the effort to dig deeper? Was there something here that justified the paperwork nightmare of a full investigation? "Sir?" A voice came from behind them. "Is there a problem?" Daniel turned. A man in an army uniform stood 3 people back in line, captain's bars on his shoulders, a face Daniel didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. The captain moved forward, his expression friendly but authoritative. "Captain Mitchell, Army CID, he said, showing identification to Walsh. "Is something irregular with these documents?" Walsh straightened slightly. "No, sir. Just routine verification." "James Miller?" Mitchell looked at Daniel. "Jim Miller from Toronto? Worked the Corps of Engineers in Germany?" Daniel's mind raced. This was it. The moment of exposure. This captain was CID, Criminal Investigation Division. He'd have access to lists, to records, to the truth about Private Daniel Hayes. "That's right," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. Mitchell smiled. "Thought that was you. Your team built the bridge outside Heidelberg last June, right?" "I remember because it was the fastest construction I'd seen." Command was impressed. The lie was so specific, so confident, that Daniel almost believed it himself. He nodded. "We had good weather. Made all the difference." "This your daughter?" Mitchell looked at Greta. "Pretty little thing. My niece is about that age." "Mary," Daniel said, "adopted her in Germany after her parents died." Mitchell turned back to Walsh. Officer, Mr. Miller's service to the reconstruction effort was exemplary. I'd consider it a personal favor if you could expedite his processing. The man's earned a smooth return home. Walsh's pen hovered over the stamp. For one terrible moment, Daniel thought he might refuse, might insist on further verification out of sheer bureaucratic stubbornness. Then the stamp came down. Welcome to the United States, Mr. Miller. You and your daughter are cleared for entry. Daniel couldn't breathe, couldn't process. His hand tightened on Greta's until she squeaked softly in protest. Thank you, he managed. They collected their stamped papers and moved toward the exit, Greta's hand in his, freedom so close Daniel could taste it. But Captain Mitchell fell into step beside them, his friendly expression never wavering. Walk with me, Jim, he said quietly. Daniel's blood turned to ice. This was it, the trap. Mitchell had vouched for them to get them away from the crowd, away from witnesses, before making the arrest. They reached a quiet corner near the baggage claim. Mitchell stopped, looked around to ensure privacy, then turned to face Daniel directly. Private Daniel Hayes, he said softly. Deserted his unit outside Munich on April 21st. Wanted for questioning regarding the disappearance of Greta Hartmann, daughter of Oberst Friedrich Hartmann. Daniel positioned himself between Mitchell and Greta. Sir, relax. Hayes, I'm not here to arrest you. Mitchell's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm here because 3 weeks ago, a German woman named Elsa Braun provided evidence that led to the arrest of 17 corrupt Allied officers. She did it in exchange for a promise that certain deserters would be allowed to slip through the cracks. He looked down at Greta. This is the Hartmann girl? Daniel didn't answer. Didn't dare. Mitchell knelt, bringing himself to Greta's eye level. You're a brave girl, Mary. Your papa, your real papa, is a good man. The kind of man the army needs more of, even if they don't always know it. He stood, meeting Daniel's eyes. Friedrich Hartmann died at a monastery outside Rosenheim. Officially, it was a robbery gone wrong. Unofficially, he got what he deserved. Mitchell pulled a card from his pocket and pressed it into Daniel's hand. If anyone ever asks questions, if anyone ever threatens you or the girl, you call that number. There are people in the army who believe justice is more than just following orders. Why are you helping us? Mitchell's expression darkened. Because I was at Malmedy. I saw what Hartmann's unit did to our POWs. Saw boys younger than you shot in cold blood for sport. His voice thickened. And I heard what he did to his own wife when he discovered she was Jewish. So when Elsa Braun said you'd saved his daughter from him, that you'd risked everything to protect an enemy child, he shook his head. That's not desertion, Hayes. That's the only kind of courage that matters. Tears burned Daniel's eyes. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Just give that girl a good life. Make her happy. Make all of this mean something. Mitchell straightened. And Hayes? As far as the Army's concerned, Private Daniel Hayes died in a field hospital on July 2nd. His death was heroic, his service exemplary, and his family will receive full benefits. You understand? I understand. Mitchell saluted, not the casual gesture of military protocol, but something deeper, more personal. Daniel returned it, and for a moment, they were just two soldiers acknowledging the impossible choices war demanded. Then Mitchell turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Daniel stood frozen, Greta's hand in his, freedom no longer a dream, but a reality pressing down with terrifying weight. Papa? Greta looked up at him. Are we safe now? Daniel knelt, pulling her into his arms. Yes, Kleine. Yes, Mary, we're safe now. Really, truly? Really, truly? She wrapped her arms around his neck, and Daniel felt the last of his armor crack open. He'd lied, stolen, deserted, and killed to get here. He'd burned every bridge, broken every rule, destroyed the man he'd been to become the father she needed. And he'd do it all again without hesitation. They walked out of Ellis Island into the golden light of an August afternoon. Manhattan rose before them like a promise, and somewhere in that vast city, a train waited to carry them west to Ohio, to family, to whatever came next. Daniel Hayes was dead. James Miller was alive. And Greta Hartman, Mary Miller now, American girl, survivor, beloved daughter, was finally, truly home. Justice had been served, not through courts or laws or official channels, but through the simple, radical act of one man choosing love over orders, humanity over hatred, the hard right over the easy wrong. In the end, that was the only justice that mattered. 15 years later, autumn leaves painted Ohio in shades of amber and rust. Mary Miller stood in the doorway of her father's workshop, watching him plane a piece of cherry wood with the same patient precision he brought to everything. The workshop smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, familiar as home, safe as breathing. She was 20 now, studying history at Ohio State, top of her class, her future bright with possibilities that once seemed impossible. "You're staring," James said without looking up. He'd never fully shed the name, never gone back to being Daniel even in private. Some transformations went too deep to undo. "Just thinking," Mary replied in the unaccented English that had replaced her childhood German. "My professor assigned an essay on post-war displaced persons, the children who survived." James's hands stilled on the plane. "That's good. Important work. I was thinking I might write about my own story." Now he looked up, and Mary saw the flash of old fear in his eyes, the reflex that never quite died, even after 15 years of safety. "Mary, not the whole truth," she said quickly, "but close to it, about what it means to be saved, to be chosen." She moved into the workshop, running her fingers along the smooth wood grain. "I've been having the dreams again. The fire, the man with ice eyes." James set down the plane and pulled her into his arms, the way he had when she was 5, when nightmares came more frequently, when the past felt closer than the present. "I'm sorry. I'd take those memories from you if I could. I know. But Papa..." She still called him that sometimes, in private, the German endearment slipping out like muscle memory. "I don't want to forget anymore. I want to remember. I want to write about children like me and men like you who saved us. I'm not a hero, Mary." "Yes, you are." Her voice was firm. "You just don't know it." The doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected. They rarely had visitors at the small farmhouse outside Columbus. James had built a quiet life here, working as a carpenter, keeping to himself, raising his daughter with all the fierce protective love he'd carried across an ocean. Mary moved to answer, but James caught her arm. Old instincts, old fears. "I'll get it," he said. The man on the porch wore an expensive suit and carried a leather briefcase. Mid-50s, graying temples, the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He looked at James with an expression that was both apologetic and determined. "James Miller? Or should I say Daniel Hayes?" Every muscle in James's body went rigid. "Who are you?" "My name is David Rosenbaum. I'm an attorney from New York." He glanced past James to where Mary stood in the hallway, her face pale. "And I'm also Greta Hartman's cousin, on her mother's side." The world tilted. James didn't invite him in, didn't move, didn't speak, just stood blocking the doorway like he'd stood in doorways and checkpoints and borders for 15 years, protecting the daughter behind him. I'm not here to cause trouble, Rosenbaum said quickly. Please, may I come in? I have information you need to hear. Something in his voice, exhaustion, grief, desperation, broke through James's defenses. He stepped aside. They sat in the small living room, Mary curled in the armchair by the fireplace, James perched on the edge of the sofa ready to fight or flee, while David Rosenbaum opened his briefcase with trembling hands. I've been searching for Greta for 12 years, he began. Since 1948, when I first learned she'd survived the war. Anna Rosenbaum, Greta's mother, was my father's younger sister. I was in America when the war broke out, safe, useless. After liberation, I went back to Germany looking for survivors. His voice cracked. I found 7 distant relatives out of 43. Anna wasn't among them. I'm sorry, Mary said softly. I didn't know about Greta until years later. Didn't know Anna had married, had a child, tried to hide in plain sight by becoming a Nazi's wife. Rosenbaum pulled out a photograph. A young woman with dark hair and eyes that looked exactly like Mary's. Anna wrote letters to a friend in Switzerland. The friend survived. She told me everything about Friedrich's discovery, about the denunciation, about the fire that was supposed to kill them both. James's hands clenched into fists. It almost did. But you saved her. Rosenbaum looked at James with something approaching awe. A farm boy from Ohio who ran into a burning building to save an enemy child, who deserted your unit, became a wanted man, killed to protect her. Do you know how rare that is? How impossibly, beautifully rare. I did what anyone should have done. But no one else did. Rosenbaum's voice turned hard. Thousands of soldiers walked past thousands of children. Most looked away. You didn't. Mary moved to sit beside James, taking his hand. Why are you here, Mr. Rosenbaum? After all these years, why now? Because the Swiss banks are finally opening their vaults, revealing accounts hidden during the war. He pulled out legal documents, spread them across the coffee table. Anna Rosenbaum's family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't poor. Before the war, they transferred assets to Switzerland for safekeeping. When they died, those assets remained untouched, waiting. James stared at the papers, his mind struggling to process. What are you saying? I'm saying that Greta, Mary, is the sole surviving heir to the Rosenbaum estate. The accounts, the properties that were seized and are now being returned, the reparations from the German government. It's not a fortune, but it's substantial. Close to $200,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. Mary's hand tightened on James's. I don't want it. Mary, Rosenbaum started. I don't want blood money. I don't want to profit from my family's murder. Her voice shook with anger and grief. What I want is for them to still be alive, for my mother to have survived, for none of it to have happened. I know. Rosenbaum's expression was infinitely gentle. But it did happen. And this money, it's your inheritance, your birthright, the last gift your family can give you. Then I'll give it away, Mary said, to organizations that help displaced children, to survivors, to people who need it more than I do. That's your choice to make. Rosenbaum pulled out one more document. Older, creased, written in German in a feminine hand. But before you decide, I want you to read this. It's the last letter Anna wrote to her friend in Switzerland, written 3 days before the fire. Mary took the letter with trembling hands. James moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The German came back to him slowly, 15 years of disuse falling away, as he translated Anna Rosenbaum's final words. I know Friedrich suspects. I see it in how he looks at Greta, as if searching for traces of my contamination. If something happens to me, if he does what I fear he will do, I pray that someone saves my daughter. Someone kind. Someone who will see her not as a Jew or a German or a soldier's child, but simply as Greta, a little girl who loves flowers and stories and deserves to grow up knowing she was loved. The letter continued, describing Greta as a baby, as a toddler, as a 5-year-old who cried when butterflies died and laughed at her own jokes. A mother's love preserved in ink and paper, the only proof she'd existed, that she'd mattered. Whoever finds this, the letter concluded, whoever saves my daughter if I cannot, thank you. You've given her the future I couldn't. You've proven that even in the darkest times, humanity survives. Mary was crying. James was crying. Even Rosenbaum, who'd read the letter 100 times, wiped his eyes. Your mother knew, Rosenbaum said quietly. She knew someone might save you. She was asking the universe for a miracle. He looked at James, and the universe sent you. James thought about that burning building, the moment of hesitation, the choice to run toward the screaming instead of away. How easily it could have gone differently. How he could have listened to Miller, could have followed orders, could have let the fire take her, but he hadn't. And because of that choice, this woman, brilliant, compassionate, fully alive, sat beside him. Because of that choice, Anna Rosenbaum's love hadn't died in the flames. It had survived, transformed, become the bond between a deserter and the daughter he'd chosen. What happens now? Mary asked. That's up to you. Rosenbaum gathered the papers. You can take the inheritance, reject it, donate it, your choice. But there's one more thing. He pulled out a final photograph. I've been building a memorial in New York, a wall of names for the Rosenbaum family members who died in the Holocaust. I'd like to add Anna's name, and I'd like you to be there when we dedicate it. Mary looked at James, a question in her eyes. He thought about staying hidden, staying safe, maintaining the fiction of James Miller and Mary Miller, Canadian refugees who'd reinvented themselves in the American Midwest. It would be easier, quieter, less complicated. But Mary deserved to know where she came from, deserved to honor the mother who'd loved her enough to marry a monster for protection, who died trying to save her daughter from that same monster's rage. We'll be there, James said. 6 months later, they stood in a small park in Manhattan, surrounded by survivors and their families, as Rabbi Goldman dedicated the Rosenbaum Memorial Wall. 73 names carved in granite. Anna's was near the top, her dates stark and final, 1915-1945. Mary laid flowers at the base, yellow roses because Rosenbaum had told her Anna loved them. Then she stepped back, and James wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Thank you, Papa, she whispered. For what? For running into the fire, for choosing me, for giving me a life my mother dreamed about but never got to see. James kissed the top of her head. This daughter who wasn't his blood, but was completely, absolutely his. Thank you for letting me. They stayed until sunset, until most of the other visitors had departed, until only Rosenbaum remained with them in the gathering dusk. There's something you should know, Rosenbaum said. I made inquiries about Private Daniel Hayes, about what happened to him officially. James tensed. And? He's listed as killed in action, July 1945. Died heroically during occupation duties. His family received full military honors. Rosenbaum smiled. But there are rumors, stories passed among veterans, about a soldier who went rogue in the final days of the war, who saved a Nazi's daughter and disappeared. Some call him a traitor. Others call him the truest American who ever lived. "What do you call him?" Mary asked. Rosenbaum looked at James, his expression filled with gratitude that transcended words. "I call him family." The Ohio farmhouse sat quiet in the November twilight. James Miller, once Daniel Hayes, always Greta's papa, worked in his garden, preparing the soil for winter. Inside, Mary studied for her history comprehensive, occasionally glancing out the window to watch her father work. The money sat in a trust, most of it already distributed to organizations helping displaced children across Europe. A small portion remained, enough to pay for Mary's education and secure their future. They didn't need much. They'd learned to live on love and stubbornness and the kind of fierce gratitude that came from knowing how close they'd come to losing everything. Sometimes, late at night, James still woke with his heart pounding, certain he heard boots on the stairs, officials at the door, the past catching up with violent certainty. But then he'd hear Mary in the next room, her gentle breathing, alive and safe and his, and the fear would fade. They'd made it. Against every odd, through every obstacle, they'd survived. Justice, in the end, hadn't come from courts or laws or the machinery of punishment. It had come from one man choosing to see a child as fully human, even when the world called her enemy. From small acts of courage compounded over time into something transformative, from choosing love when hate would have been easier. They say, even now, that somewhere in the Veterans Affairs archives, buried deep in classified files, there's a photograph of Private Daniel Hayes holding a blonde child outside a burning building in Munich. They say his smile in that photo is the smile of a man who's just discovered his purpose. They say the little girl's hand is clutched tight in his, and she's looking up at him like he's the whole world. They say the photograph is labeled Unknown Soldier, Unknown Child, April 1945. But those who know, those who were there, who understand what really happened, they say the photograph tells the only truth that matters. Sometimes, when everything burns, love is what survives the fire. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we make when no one's watching, when the rules fail and only conscience remains, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to remember that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage. And subscribe, because every week we bring you stories that prove humanity is worth believing in, even on the darkest days.